Sigue en sintonía de nuestra programación.
Está empezando el show del doctor Roy Aranda, donde abordaremos temas sobre separación niños de padres, casos de violencia, traumas con los indocumentados, cómo resistir ante tiempos de pandemias. Llámanos en vivo al 1-888-900-2811, extensión 6, y haz tus propias preguntas al aire. ¡Comenzamos!
Good evening, my dear Tribuna TV viewers. Buenas noches, queridos televidentes del famosísimo show Tribuna TV. As promised, I'm back. we're in the month of November. There's another show scheduled for next week. I'll fill you in a moment. We have a topic today that is a painful topic for me on a personal level because of my involvement in working with children who've been the victims of child abuse and neglect, as well as sexual abuse. But also because of the amount of work and effort and evaluations and patients that I have who have children who themselves have in some ways been victimized. So the show for today, el show de hoy día, today is November 10, 2022, hoy es noviembre 10, 2022. It's a Thursday, a windy Thursday from where I am. Bien ventoso. And the show for today is entitled Child Abuse and Neglect, More Common Than You Think, Signs and Interventions. I have a special guest, Dr. Robin Lynch, who I'll introduce momentarily, and my consultant, who I rely on heavily, Dr. Peter Canaris. He won't be joining us today, but he certainly chimes in on a regular basis. I also want to mention that we have my producer, Oscar Luna, and he's the magician behind putting together and organizing this show so that you can see it in a manner that looks presentable. So that said, the show is being recorded live right now on YouTube. Está grabado en YouTube actualmente. By tomorrow, it will be available on Tribuna TV's website, on Facebook and other social media platforms. Y a partir de mañana estará accesible en no solamente YouTube, pero Facebook y también en Tribuna TV, okay? Y en otras plataformas. So that said, we have several slides. So I encourage my viewers, tenemos varias presentaciones que incluyen varios slides. I encourage viewers to look at the slides, take photos of the slides for later review, pueden sacar fotos, or you can wait for the video recording, and then you can take screenshots and sort of put them aside and refer to them from time to time. As usual, it's my hope, como siempre, mi deseo, to not only focus on what I consider are interesting topics, but especially important topics, and topics that are geared to empower the viewers, that are geared to enrich you, geared to somehow provide educational assistance and resources that the viewers can rely on. El propósito es para proveer una plataforma educacional y brindar apoyo y respaldar a los televidentes cuando sea necesario que tengan recursos. So we do have a number of slides. We're going to be going over quite a few things, Dr. Lynch and I. And at the end of the show, we'll provide you with a wonderful resources slide as well. So that said, I wanted to get started with, por favor, Oscar, si quieres saludar a los televidentes. I've asked Oscar. He's telling everybody be cold. I'd like to add to that, be careful with the cold, be careful with the viruses, and be careful with all instances of violence that's taking place across the country. 3 kinds of things that I think you should all watch out for. Por favor, Oscar, el primer slide 1. And here you see the title, as I mentioned, and you can see from the at the top that, again, my guest, Dr. Robin Lynch, and consultant Peter Canaris. And by way of introduction, many of you probably are aware of, certainly people in New York and especially in Long Island area, that in Long Island, a little 8-year-old boy, Thomas, died on January 17 of 2020. So this is like 2 years and about 10 months ago, as a result of hypothermia from sleeping on the floor of the freezing garage where he lived. What ensued was a 2-year, 10-month-long investigation and prosecution, culminating in the conviction of his father, former NYPD officer Michael Valva, on November 4th, 2022, just this past Friday. It was just Friday. Upon seeing that, and just by way of some information, the jurors in Suffolk County deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Now, I have been following this case closely. I live in Long Island, so I was following it closely since it unfolded. And as has been my experience, not only in child abuse cases, but cases of domestic violence, cases of COVID, cases of problems with immigrants, cases where we've had disasters and all sorts of other kinds of issues that you're aware that I try to produce this show that serves, to offer this kind of educational format. Sadly, at the heels of such high-profile cases, also the Rob supermarket in Buffalo, and the school shooting in Uvalde, for instance, it behooves society to take a close look at the overwhelming problems of child abuse and neglect with an eye towards prevention. And this is generally true when we're looking at risk management and disasters and what to do to try to handle those kinds of tragedies that are human caused. It's a little bit more difficult when they're acts of nature, but even there's a lot that can be done by way of prevention and planning. In memory of this little boy, Thomas, I was inspired to produce this show following the verdict. My guest, Dr. Robin Lynch, and I will provide a comprehensive overview of child abuse and neglect, the psychological effects and manifestations, and interventions. And there's many different contexts in which psychological treatment and interventions take place. This is a topic that needs to be addressed with the viewers due to its prevalence. It is our hope we can provide useful educational information and resources to the viewers to help empower them. The show is dedicated to victims of abuse and in memory of Thomas Valva. Oscar, por favor, el slide número 2. So I wanted to show our viewers who may not be familiar and others who are. This is a picture, a photo of Thomas Valva during happier moments in his life. And I have to tell you, I've seen pictures of him before, for well over 2 years. I've seen the pictures. And in preparing for this show, I saw this photo. And, I confess, it brings tears to my eyes. And I want to be able to reach out and tell him something and comfort him. And of course, I can't do that. I'm hoping, however, that with the show, symbolically, I can do that with other children who are victims of abuse and neglect or on the verge of becoming victimized. There's many risk factors that I'm hoping we can offset, that we can help reach a point of prevention so that these little children symbolically and in real life can be embraced and hugged and taken care of by their caretakers. That said, por favor, Oscar, slide number 3, slide número 3. I wanted to introduce my erudite guest, Dr. Robin Lynch. I know Robin for many, many years, and I met her, I believe, through the forensic division of New York State Psychological Association. There were many instances that we collaborated together on programs, consultations, referrals, back and forth, peer supervision. And Robin was a guest on this particular show at least twice before with attorney Jorge Rosario. And she also was a guest twice in my master's level forensic psychology class at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where we actually did a mock trial of a child abuse and neglect case with two parents who were the focus of attention. So I wanted to certainly extend a big thank you to Robin for your involvement. I put up the you can see the background. I don't really want to go too much into it. There's plenty here. She's a graduate of Columbia University Teachers College. You can see her credentials, PhD program in social psychology. She's done a tremendous amount of involvement in conflict resolution and being involved in the first and second panels of expert witnesses for child custody cases. She was involved in New York State Psychological Association in the Child Custody Evaluation Committee of the Forensic Division. Again, she's published. I've given you some of the publications there. And it's also, I'm delighted to say as well that she is the president-elect, effective 1 minute or 1 second after midnight, January 1 of 2023 of the Forensic Division, so of New York State Psychological Association. So, Robin, I'm totally, completely delighted and inspired that you're here. Did I miss anything out? Or because I know that your resume is about 30 pages long. Anything you'd care to add? Puedes sacar a slide, por favor, Oscar. Anything that you'd care to add before I move on to the next slide?
No, nothing at all.
All right. Por favor, Oscar, número 4. I have one more slide with a photograph, and this is a special acknowledgement to United States Army retired Major Jorge L. Rosario. He's an attorney. I provided you with his biographical data underneath his name. He happens to be a neighbor of mine 2 houses away. And he also has been a guest on my TV show, and he also has been a guest on my at my class at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So I did want to give a shout out to him. He's specialized for many, many years as an attorney working in cases pertaining to child abuse, neglect, family law. And he's young enough that he has a bright future going forward. So, Jorge, this is an acknowledgement to you. Puedes sacar a slide. So, Robin, we have several slides, but I know that you and I, for some time now, for quite a bit of time, we've gone back and forth with discussions about Thomas Valva, Michael Valva, his father, the circumstances surrounding his death. And there were a number of occasions that it was not just you and me, but also with Jorge Rosario involved. And we've mentioned in other presentations, we focused on some of the legal aspects from the perspective of Jorge Rosario as an attorney. So I know that we've talked about it, and I was delighted when I reached out to you after the verdict on November 4th, and I said, I know, Robin, this is last minute notice, but I have an open date, November 10th, and I really feel that I want to do this show, and I can't think of anyone that I'd want to do it with more than you, and you graciously accepted. So that said, let me turn it over to you, because I know that this is your area of expertise, and you have a lot to say about Thomas.
Thank you, Roy. And thank you for that lovely introduction. And particularly, though, and especially, thank you for doing this show in honor of Thomas Valva, because while I was very glad to hear from you a few days ago that you were doing this show to not only honor Thomas Valva, but as in an effort to bring attention to this phenomenon, because he is not the only child who has been killed under these circumstances, and your willingness and interest in bringing this to the public's attention is just so important. So while I was very glad to have your call and very pleased to be participating this evening, it was also a sad last several days as I reviewed the case, and it was just a reminder of how heartbreaking this case is and these cases are. And I think this show, along with other efforts, come under the umbrella of prevention, and prevention is like sledding uphill. At times, I had developed a website on this issue years ago. It's still out there, Conflict Uncomplicated, and an occasional person goes on, but bringing attention to this issue of the children and what happens to victims of abuse in the courtroom. By
the way, just so the viewers to know, I have a reference to that at the end.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. But prevention on any issue is very difficult. And people have been trying to bring attention to this issue. I would like to think that maybe incrementally we are getting there, because recently there have been some developments. And I do think, as heartbreaking as this case is, and it really, as you said earlier, brings tears to your eyes, it is in many respects a classic case of how abusers prevail in the court and how children die as a result. Now, we know that not all the children die. There's Jacqueline Franchetti. I know she's well known on Long Island because of her daughter's murder, little Kira, more than 5 years ago now, but she has done tremendous advocacy work in this area in New York State to bring attention to this phenomenon. I sometimes think of Chris Hayes's podcast, Why Is This Happening? Because really, while it has been this pattern that is so characteristic and so classic in these cases has been brought to the attention through books and articles since the 90s, yet only recently do I have hope something actually is going to be done about it. It is, and I can go through, and I would like to go through some of the typical things about this case, and that what came to mind to me, not the particulars of the case that little Thomas was they don't use the term autistic anymore, but on the spectrum, that he was needed care in schools. His communication skills were limited, that of his brothers as well. The fact that his father, who abused him so badly and who is now going away for life for the second-degree murder of little Thomas, the fact that he was a policeman, these things to me are secondary to the phenomenon at hand, because what we have seen in these cases where the abuser ends up being awarded the children by the family court is that it doesn't matter where the parent comes from, ethnically, professionally, economically, or in any other way. This phenomenon, the people who do this kind of thing can emerge out of any cultural milieu. Now, oftentimes abuse is seen as an environmental problem, a response to deprivation and a very poor environment with poor stimuli and so forth. And certainly, children can be neglected and hurt under those circumstances. But when we see abuse of this type, it comes from, in my findings, from my work, from what I call an affect dysregulated individual. This is somebody who cannot manage their feelings. They need to project them. So they take them out on a child. They're apt to take them out on some other individual. And the impact of these people who are dysregulated, who cannot manage their feelings, and who have no awareness of the impact they have on others, is to create a dynamic where the object of their dysregulated feelings, their overwhelming sense of anger and emptiness that so often is what takes hold in these people, is they begin to internalize what's been projected on them. Now, Roy, you and I know these are old terms in psychology, projection and internalization and so forth. But what you begin to create with the dysregulated person is a situation where the abuser believes they're a victim of the little boy, of Thomas and his brother, who was the other one who was sleeping on the garage floor in freezing temperatures and abused for years by his father, leaving apart the stepmother for the moment. Yet here was the father believing himself to be victim, and who believed he was a victim of the little boy's mother. Indeed, the court was convinced that the father, the one who's going up to jail for the rest of his life, who killed Thomas, he was awarded custody a few years ago. And the mother, the protective parent, was under investigation. I believe it was for neglect, but it took forever for them to sort it out. She was regarded by the court as the more irresponsible party, and the father was regarded by the court as the more responsible party to raise the children. This was a reversal of what indeed was the case. And it is always these reversals that characterize these cases in which a child is murdered or is given, where the court awards custody to the abusive parent. And that is what is characteristic of what's going on here. That's the psychological dynamic that's going on there. You had, as the poor mother said, no one could be convinced that her little boy was in danger. And in fact, they turned on her. They found her difficult. She was representing herself. She got pretty excited in court and things like that. Who wouldn't? She saw what was about to happen. She couldn't stop it. And this is what we see in court all the time, and why there was even a report done in 2009, going back now more than 10 years, when this problem was brought to the public's attention, and then a child had just been killed under the same set of circumstances. And it was remarked in this report that was done by the state legislature that family court may be the saddest place on earth, where we see these cases go unresolved. Another characteristic of this case is that it is thought to be rare. It is thought to be an anomaly. We deal with thousands and thousands of cases. Yes, we're going to let one's going to slip through the cracks. Indeed, that's not even true. Even if it was true, you can't let every child's life has to be held in value. The fact that only a few children die a year in New York State as a result of this is what the best statistics offer us. There's a couple of things there.
Probably, just to interrupt, those are probably
underreported, right? They're underreported, and they certainly don't reflect. And they don't. They're almost certainly underreported, and they don't reflect the number of children where custody is given to the abusive parent. And this is systemic. This is not a rare event. Fortunately, though, Jacqueline Franchetti, the mother of little Kira who was killed under the same set of circumstances where the court turned on her, she did indeed, because she's very skilled as a public relations executive, she knew how to bring attention to this problem. And through years of effort, undaunted, she was really the driving force between Governor Cuomo and then, God bless her, Governor Hochul picked it up, the Blue Ribbon Commission, where 20 of us spent half a year going through this issue and resolved in a report unanimously that psychologists who are asked to evaluate these cases must have mandatory training. That piece of legislation, it was converted into a piece of legislation which was passed by almost unanimously by both houses of the New York State Legislature and is expected to be signed into law at any time before the new year by Governor Hochul. It is hoped that this training, which will focus on abuse and domestic violence dynamics, it will focus on trauma. Trauma is often very counterintuitive. Addiction is often highly correlated with these kinds of cases. That often is very, it's a hidden phenomenon. Addicts are able to hide from their closest family members their addiction for years. There are a number of other things about this case that are very, it's a pattern we see. There's no follow-up on cases. So judges, the courts, and everybody involved in them they don't know down the line. There's no systematic way where they find out, well, what was the result of my decision? That's it. It's over. They don't know they don't know what happened. And that's true for the psychologist and other mental health professionals that are asked to weigh in, and the other attorneys. There's no clearinghouse for these cases. There's no way of accounting for them. And fundamentally, there's no understanding of affect dysregulation and what it means to be dysregulated, and the dynamic that creates. And I just wanted to see, so my point is, not only does this happen in New York State, it happens throughout the country. And it happens abroad. A lot of work is being done on this in England, Australia, Canada, and other places where this same phenomenon plays out. Indeed, I just learned only a few days ago about a program in France. So concerned are they about the secretive nature of abuse, this counterintuitive quality. It's often not seen, and until it's way too late, it's not believed because it seems so counterintuitive. It goes against our inherent biases. The program in France is called Papillon. I wish I knew more about it. I think it's just underway, so there isn't data to say how effective it is. But there are mailboxes that are being left throughout towns and villages and cities that children are being told about, where they can put in a little slip of paper in the mailbox and just say, things aren't so great at home, or I'm scared, or anything they would like. Experts will look at this, analyze it, look into it, of course, and children may have different reasons for wanting to write such notes, but it is a way for the children to bring attention to what's happening to them when the system, just by its nature, this is not really to blame anybody, by its nature can't see what's happening. And I was very impressed when I heard that about that program. But I would say, so in absence of not really knowing about dysregulation and the trauma that's created and addiction and so forth, our biases, they fill in the blanks. It's human nature. Neurobiologists know this. We fill in what we don't know with our own biases. And typically, I mean, we have stronger feelings than you might realize. When a woman comes in and starts talking about abuse, she is automatically, and we know this from Joan Myers' research, viewed negatively by the court. That's much less true than for men. When her complaint of abuse is coupled with the other side, the male side, though, it's a real gender thing, saying she's claiming abuse, I'm claiming alienation, I haven't abused anybody. She just wants to keep the children for herself and win this battle in court. That is a very powerful argument, Myers found in court, and generally prevails. The evidence is overwhelming. Joan Meyer did an ingenious thing of studying appeals cases where this was really revealed. So often this whole phenomenon can't be studied because the cases aren't made available to the public. We can't look at them. It's we get this data anecdotally and in other creative, innovative ways of researching. But that's another, there is bias and gender bias and other biases can work their way in there without the facts. So what I've argued for is that when you have a dysregulated dynamic and these role reversals and so forth, you really have to look very, very carefully over an extended period of time. And I have my own thoughts about how that can be done. But you have to look very carefully at what exactly did happen at, let's say, breakfast this morning. Was there breakfast this morning? What happened? Very, very carefully, step by step, over a period of time, it becomes apparent who, if there is abuse going on and who's doing it. Abuse now is referred to as coercive control because abuse can be emotional abuse, which has been shown empirically to be the most devastating form. It can be tragically sexual abuse, which is rarely believed, as you know, Roy, very hard to prove in court. It can be physical abuse. It can be financial abuse. It can be all these ways of controlling the child in this case. Oftentimes it's a partner, and indeed, I just wanted to see if there was anything. Yeah, all the things that come up with that, because when you're the victim of abuse, not only are you apt to internalize the fact that this is all your fault, which is what the abuser is telling you, but you're apt to become very attached to the abuser. We saw that very clearly in the Wisink case, where the child, in that instance, they knew the father was abusive and the child was really trying to stay. It was a little girl trying to stay with her father. She wanted to stay with her father so she could beat up her mother. That was how far she had gone. And you remember from our old psychoanalytic days, there's identification with the aggressor. All of these things can come up in a dysregulated dynamic. I would say, I just want to see one more story, and then Roy, I really should let you get to the slides that you've prepared. There is, to show you the problem of believability and in these cases, there is a story written by Armstrong and Miller called a False Report. It's a book, and it documents an occurrence now several years ago that began in Texas, where a young woman on good terms with her family, but striking out on her own, they were in the northwest part of the country, took her own apartment. Sadly, a horrible rapist got in there, raped her. She was devastated, went back to her family in the Pacific Northwest, and became sort of numb and speechless. And at first, they took her in and embraced her and tried to get her all the help she could. But when she didn't turn around her behavior and kind of regulate herself and get back on track and just remained withdrawn, they began to interpret her behavior as some sort of regression, laziness, something. They attributed it to negative characteristics about herself, to the point where they said, what really happened to you? You just wanted to come home because you couldn't handle living alone. I don't think this rape happened. And indeed, the police in Texas were coming to the same conclusion. To the point, this all played out over time, to the point where she went in and confessed to lying to them. A few years later, because there were a couple of investigators who were really onto these rapes, they realized that this rapist was taping, that was part of his sickness, was taping his rapes. And they found her rape in there among the tapes. So in other words, she became convinced herself, as did everybody around her, that she was lying. To the credit of those police departments, they are using this as part of their training, but it shows you how people who are abusive, sexually abusive, physically abusive, some combination, the need for coercive control to control somebody, they can create this dynamic where they begin to think you begin to think you're the problem. And the court goes along with that, and the system goes along with that. Until we understand this better, until evaluators, the mental health professionals who look at these in the courts know and do evaluations for them, until they know what to look for in these cases. Because currently, I was just on a case recently, big case in another state. The evaluator totally missed the level of abuse that's going on. And boy, do we have a mess now, because it's very hard to course correct once the court's gone down a certain path. It's very hard to get through the appeals process and it's very complicated. And this is a common occurrence. It's systemic. So I would say that there's one more thing. There is a problem with these investigations. I know it is overwhelming what Child Protective Services, the caseloads those investigators have, but they do regularly miss the abuse. I mean, you all may remember the Nixmari case. The investigators had been there the night before that she was killed. So they didn't even look in a back room where she was. There is the demeanor of an abusive person is often, again, very counterintuitive. They often seem to be the more rational person. All of this played out in poor Thomas Valva's case. And it is training and understanding of this dynamic that to me is so important. It can occur in the wealthiest homes, in the poorest homes, in any ethnic group. That this we see here. One thing about New York is you see it all right here. But when you have this level of dysregulation, sometimes the other partner is dysregulated as well. That's been referred to as assortative mating by a theorist named Dutton, where both are really abusive people. That can occur as well. Often partners of abusers, there's another phenomenon that occurs around helplessness that develops. But the patterns are pretty clear. You have to know what to look for. But I think we're getting there with the Blue Ribbon Commission. That mandatory training is going to go a long way. I am hoping to turning this around. Indeed, not only here in New York State, but when they reauthorized VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, in last spring, there's now a whole section dedicated to this issue of children being awarded custody to the abuser and losing their lives as a result. And that phenomenon alone has been raised as it's part of the new writing of that law. It's an addition to that law, excuse me. And there are funds dedicated also in the way that law is written to providing this kind of training. So I just, with shows like this, with greater the Blue Ribbon Commission, the reauthorized VAWA, I just want to be hopeful. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Robin, for that most informative presentation. I mean, you gave me a nice break, which is pretty cool. Very, very important, very relevant. We have several slides that we'll get into momentarily that actually give you definitions and some of the statistics that will provide an objective basis for many of the things that you said. I did want to bring up a couple of points. You mentioned, for instance, that the abuser sometimes takes on the role or manipulates, if you will, the system or what's going on in such a way that the abuser sometimes comes out giving the impression of being the victim or in some way victimized. And that's not too dissimilar to what happens in domestic violence cases, where you see the victim of domestic violence as a result of being maybe more emotional or agitated or willing to say, I'm to blame, I did it, taking on the guilt, coming off as the abuser as opposed to the victim. We saw that with Gabby Petito. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that it takes some of these super high-profile cases to bring about some change, and I am very grateful to see that as a result of the Gabby Petito death by homicidal death as a result of domestic violence. Just recently passed the 1-year anniversary. I'm delighted to see that there's been much effort across the many states now to require formal training and to make the procedures more systematic across different states and easier to have information from one jurisdiction made available to another jurisdiction, which is what we also need with child abuse and neglect. You indicated that appealing a case is difficult. That should not come as too much of a surprise. In as much as when you have an appeal, the appeal is based on the record. So you cannot introduce new information. There are some exceptions, but in general, you simply cannot all of a sudden say, I've got something new that I want to introduce. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. You also are talking about prevention, and I agree with you. Prevention in and of itself is an intervention, and it's the first step. Intervention. It's an intervention based on realizing and recognizing that there's the possibility that something is going to happen if it has not already happened. We want to at least try to intervene before something happens or at the very early stages of it, and do something. So prevention doesn't exist in thin air. I mean, what you want to do in terms of educating society in general about concepts like domestic violence, child abuse, neglect, etc. Those are educational platforms geared to a general viewer population, and not necessarily because they themselves, there's some question that they may be at risk. So prevention is what I perceive to be like a first line intervention. So that's very important. Let's look at some of the issue. Also, I did want to mention to the viewers that the family court system is very, very, very different than criminal and civil trial courts, how they proceed. You have many different players. The children have law guardians. There's initially fact-finding hearings. So there's really, we're not going to get into it, but, I just wanted to point that out. Viewers who either have been involved in family court or maybe know about it or are aware of it, there's certainly considerable information available on the internet that gives you education in terms of what happens in family court cases, and I provided some of these references at the end of the show. Let's go over some definitions quickly and statistics, and then we'll get into more of the nuts and bolts of the presentation. Oscar, por favor, número 5. So I'm just going to quickly go over, what abuse is. It's a parent or person legally responsible for the child who inflicts serious physical injury or creates a substantial risk of physical injury or commits a sexual offense against the child or allows someone else to inflict harm on a child. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have, a combination of sexual offense, neglect, and physical injury, so it's not mutually exclusive. Neglect, the child's physical, mental, or emotional condition has been impaired or placed in imminent danger of impairment by failure of the parent or personally legally responsible to exercise a minimum degree of care. When you were talking, for instance, financial neglect, that would financial abuse, that would more likely fall under a neglect spectrum. Por favor, Oscar, el número 6. In this slide, I'm giving you some definitions and statistics. We see child abuse in many different ways, as Robin mentioned: physical, sexual, psychological, and neglect. Physical abuse consists of, I give you a whole cookbook here: hitting, kicking, dragging, shaking, smothering. I don't want to go over it all, but you get this quite a number of things that can happen. Make a photograph of it or screenshot. In Thomas's case, hypothermia. Okay. Sexual abuse, inducing or coercing a child to engage in sexual acts, fondling, penetration, exposing a child to sexual activities. Emotional abuse is very broad, can happen in many different ways. Behaviors that harm a child's emotional well-being: name calling, insulting, shaming, threatening, rejection, and removing or taking away or not giving any parental love. Rejection of love, withdrawal of love. Here's a number: approximately 1 in 7 children have experienced child abuse and or neglect. In 2020, there were almost 620,000 reported cases of child abuse. Most common form was neglect. In 2020, there were 1,713 deaths from child abuse and treatment. This averages a little bit less than 5 deaths every day. Most child abuse victims were abused by their mothers, fathers, a combination of both. About 4 of 5 abusers are the parents of the victims. Por favor, Oscar, el número 7. Here I've given you an indication of child fatalities due to abuse. Top 10 states, statistics from 2020. Texas leads the pack, followed by California, New York in third place with 105. You get the numbers there. As I indicated, and Robin, you seem to be in agreement, that I'm sure that many of the statistics or the numbers are really underrepresentation because victims don't readily come forward. And many times there may be a indication of manner of death that's sort of up in the air. The person, the witness, or the person who discovers it may come up with a story that's seemingly plausible, and as a result of that, you get a cause of death that does not involve either domestic violence or child abuse, child neglect, and so forth. Puedes sacar el slide. Robin, those were 3 slides. Any comments on those particular, the nomenclature and the numbers?
I appreciate that overview. I think what needs to be understood is that this is an all too common phenomenon that does not it doesn't surface. And we have to become aware of it. We can't hide from it. We do so at our peril and at our society's peril. The cost of this, if you want to be materialistic about it, is just in the billions of abuse. But we need to be aware of what it's doing to our families, to our loved ones, and to ourselves. I think also it needs, the point about it being a pattern, people can have a certain inability to restrain temper. They're under tremendous stress. There can also be, for a reason of trauma, they can blow up and hit somebody in their family. That's
right. We saw that under COVID-19 stay at home.
Exactly.
Employment, not working, parents having to teach virtually their children.
What we're talking about here is a pattern of behavior, and not something that is driven by an external stressor. An external stressor may aggravate it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, as you were saying, COVID, financial stress, other phenomena can certainly aggravate this condition. But we're talking about a problem where you've got an individual who can't regulate.
Yeah. Robin, as a hypothetical, unless you're familiar with any literature, but as a hypothetical, is it possible for a person who is an abuser and sort of gets away with it to use that getting away with it as a learning tool to do it better next time and not get caught next time and continue doing it, continue a pattern of abuse and learn how to do it better? And if so, is there a way to intervene?
To answer the last part of that question, I think intervention is going to come about through awareness. Victims need to be aware. Their families and loved ones need to be aware. Abuse can also occur sadly, in educational settings, as we know, in places of worship, in businesses. It can occur, sadly, in many places. But awareness is going to, that this is what's happening to you, or if you can't see it because you've been so affected by it, then maybe your loved ones or family or dearest friends can help you to see it and to protect you. But I'm not, they talk about the cycle of abuse, but I don't, as you know, you go in and out of these periods of the abuser does, of becoming terribly abusive, and then a period of rapprochement, and the victim gets caught up in that. That's a controversial concept, but I'm not aware of that they actually get better at it, because the way I see it, when you're dysregulated that way, you often don't see yourself doing what you're doing. In other words, an abuser will hit their kid or hit their anybody in their loved one, knock them on the floor, say, "What are you doing on the floor?" "Well, you just slugged me." "I didn't touch you." And stop blaming other people and get up. They disassociate when they're doing it, in my view. Now, this is what my work and my experience and my own looking into this and investigations and the papers I've written have sort of focused on that. They don't see themselves doing what they're doing in many instances. So I don't see them getting better at it, but I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong.
Let's look at some indicators and then the effects on children. Oscar, por favor, el número 8. So just briefly, again, I encourage viewers to take a photo or a screenshot. Indicators of abuse, serious injuries. This is, certainly more the physical. Frequently appearing injuries, destructive, aggressive, or disruptive behavior, passive, withdrawn, emotionless behavior in the child, fear of going home, fear of the parents, indicators of sexual abuse, symptoms of sexually transmitted diseases, injury to the genital area, difficulty or pain sitting or walking, sexually suggestive, inappropriate, or promiscuous behavior, age and appropriate knowledge of sexual relations, sexual victimization of other children. Getting back to the victimization, I've had cases where an adult was charged with sexual molestation of a child, indicating that the child was jumping up and down on me and sort of provoking it and asking for it. So sort of like role playing. So in other words, you yielded to, it was the child that did this, not you. Indicators of neglect, malnourishment, listlessness or fatigue, stealing or begging food. Loss of weight would certainly be another one. The appearance in school or out on the street or among social groups. Untreated medical needs or dental care, frequent absences from school or latenesses. That's a big one. Child is left unattended without supervision. So that pretty much covers the spectrum. And let's take a look at the effects on children. Número 9. So this is probably a slide. Número 9, Oscar? Not too dissimilar with some of the other symptoms we've seen in children who've been victims of violence or school shootings or problems in schools or disasters, whether they're human caused or not. Anger, separation anxiety, fear of leaving the parent, fears, phobias, low self-esteem, sense of loss, abandonment, helplessness, hopelessness, loss of trust, problems with sleep, appetite, problems at school. That is a biggie. Use or experimentation with substances, problems with relationships. So you would look for behavioral changes in relationships. Guilt feelings, talking about it, feeling guilty about something. Self-destructive thoughts and acts, behavioral problems, destructive acts, effects of relocation. This is a risk factor, and we'll get into risk factors in a little while. Relationships with separated siblings and other families members deteriorate. So puede sacar ese slide. Robin, we're going to get into interventions, but on these two slides, anything that you want to comment on before we get into the interventions?
I would say, yes, that's a really good list. I would say as well that you need to be very sensitive to this. Often it is quite hidden in children. And so it is not so obvious, but as you say, behavioral change is a big one, and problems in school and so forth. That's where it's harder to hide it there. But that's a really good list.
Okay. Let's look at interventions. Por favor, Oscar, el número 10. And I broke in several components. From a societal standpoint, and Robin, you brought this up often enough, what are organizations doing? The role of media. Media can play an educational role. They can do interviews. They can bring, as they did, the Thomas Valva story to the light, certainly during the trial, daily and repeatedly. Social media, whatever you have available in social media. Just be wary that social media can also be full of misinformation and hype and people lurking, and it's not necessarily your best way of getting information. And you may also want to worry about children in social media who are victims of cyberbullying and or peer pressure, and as a result of that, you have no idea because it's sort of easy to be anonymous in social media. So it does have positive effects, but there's a downside to it. Religious groups always, very, very potentially important sources of support. Fundraisers. I think I mentioned to you, Robin, that I've done several fundraisers on child abuse, neglect, and a couple of other things, violence in schools. But I think that that's another important way of making money available, as well as education. Shelters, support groups, educational campaigns. So I'm like what happened after Gabby Petito, what's happening now after Thomas Valva. This is an educational campaign geared towards educating in general the public and geared towards hopefully providing anchors of hope to individuals who are in some way suffering and perhaps at the threshold of maybe crossing a line that you don't want them to cross, and they don't want to either. Okay. Political hearings, Congress, they routinely have hearings. They invite people. There's many ways of looking at this on the internet. Appointments that might be made of people that are spent like what Robin was saying, the blue ribbon. And executive orders, signing with the authority of the governor and or president who has the authority, signing some sort of an executive order. Legislative lobbying. This is like people in the community or people that are interested, and maybe they belong to organizations or they belong to certain listservs, and they decide that they want to go forward and reach out to their congressmen. And they do grassroots and lobbying. Lobbying can be formal, and grassroots is certainly more informal with a push that can have a tremendous amount of success. Enacting bills and the passage of laws. Legal, police, the role of the police, law enforcement, CPS, courts. Courts make determinations of placements. It can be removal. If there is a removal, kinship placement, foster care placement. Courts can make treatment recommendations, anger management, parenting classes, all sorts of things, attending substance abuse classes. And courts can, in cases that there simply seems to be no remedy or no solution, loss of parental rights and making it possible for the child to be adopted. And número 11, por favor. Continuing psychological. Psychologists do evaluations and treatment. Evaluations, and we've covered some of this. Assessing risk factors. For instance, in the child age, younger age is potentially a higher risk. Special needs, such as developmental intellectual disabilities, mental health issues, chronic physical illnesses, the family member or caregiver, young age, single, large number of dependent children, low income, substance abuse, mental health issues, history of abuse or neglect in the caretaker, social isolation, family disorganization, parenting stress. IPV is intimate partner violence, and strained parent-child relationships. I'm going over this with a little bit more detail because I think that it's very important for the viewers to be aware of the risk factors. Community, the community also has risk factors: violence, poverty, residential instability, high unemployment rates. And let's look at assessing protective factors. What are those things that are beneficial, that you can rely on, that you can count on? You know, sort of the trump cards that you have. What are the positives that you have? Supportive family and social interactions, parental employment, as opposed to COVID-19, when many people lost their jobs and had to stay at home and they were struggling financially. Adequate housing, access to health. You know, you not only do you want to have adequate housing, you know, you want to make sure that you have electricity turned on and heat and running water, amenities, you know, access to healthcare and social services. Treatments, I'm not going to cover the kinds of treatments, but the sources of directing the treatment to the child or children, parent or caretaker, and others. There may be collaterals, there may be other individuals that are involved as part of the treatment process, could be family counseling. So puede sacar el slide. Robin, I covered a lot. I'm leaving it up to you for a few minutes to pull this a little bit more together. I think that the interventions are very important. And, you know, we were talking about prevention, so now we got into interventions.
Well, I like the point where you talk about community, because we are all actors on this stage. We need to speak up in a constructive way. We need to understand what's the abusive dynamic is about, and we need to respond in a constructive way. And I would just like to add that another variation of what we're talking about is a couple can get together and have a child or adopt a child and have several children or whatever, start a family, and find that one of their children, maybe even more than one, may be dysregulated. In other words, you got to be careful with this, but there can be as one esteemed therapist, investigator in this area said, you get a big genetic load, and you may be, and I've really been criticized for, and appropriately so, for suggesting that there's a bad seed. But there are people who are born with emotions that are very, very difficult to regulate. And you'll have a child growing up that is very difficult to regulate and seems to be beyond the capacities of mental health facilities and other professionals to help. And hopefully we're learning more and more about helping these kinds of young people, but they're the ones who can become juvenile delinquents. Oppositional defiant disorder is what develops, this kind of thing. So just to give you another aspect of this, we need to be sensitive to it and to appreciate. Listen, there are people who are dysregulated who learn to deal with it and have gone on to tremendous accomplishments. I mean, what I'm trying to say, I don't mean to suggest that because you're dysregulated, you're going to be abusive and create a very destructive abusive dynamic. You can learn to manage it. There's therapies for this. There's treatment for this. But it can hit anywhere, and it's our role is to not enable it. As loved ones, family, friends, part of a community, a school, a business, or whatever, we can't enable it. We can't become intimidated by it. We must respond constructively.
You can't find it funny either, and you can't ignore it either. Like when the child says, you know, like, I think that I'm not, you know, I'm worthless. Oh, you'll get over it. I mean, that's not necessarily the best.
That's a great point. That is a great point. You don't just ignore those things. You'll get over it. Exact. That's a great point.
So I purposely steered clear of diagnoses, mostly because you do not need to have a formal diagnosis
Right.
to have child abuse, neglect, or sexual molestation type of a finding. There are times you may forensically be asked to do an evaluation, and you'll be asked if there is or if there is not a diagnosis. So with offenders, you're looking more at the oppositional conduct disorders, those kinds of anger management kinds of problems. And with the victims, you're looking more at the possible PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, and other kinds of disorders where there's isolation that's prevalent. Let's look at the last slide. Por favor, Oscar número 12. We're coming to the last slide, but I think this is very important for the viewers. So my contact information is at the top. My consultant, Peter, is next to that. Robin, here is the information I gave about conflict uncomplicated.
Right.
There's the link. There's many sources here for improving child welfare. Here's your links. Child welfare information, child welfare policy primer. You have National Domestic Violence Hotline, phone numbers, links, also prevention package that I provided there, one in English and one in Spanish. Okay, you can see there the prevention technical package, and right underneath that in Spanish. There's the New York State Psychological Association. Robin and I are members, and a shout out to the forensic division with Robin, who's going to be the president-elect next year. A shout out to President Barbara Katipanakis at this right now, presently in 2022. I provide you with the address and the link. I'd also like to let the viewers know that within the New York State Psychological Association, if you open it up and there's information that's available for a general viewership, be aware that we have what's called a disaster resource network. I happen to be the chair of it, so along with Dr. Jess Kovler, who's co-chair. And this is a committee that reaches out or is available, not doesn't reach out, but is available to individuals, associations when problems emerge, like a school shooting, for instance. We're there as a source of support. Also, we have a trauma special interest group that focuses on traumatic events. All this information is available on NISPA's website. American Psychological Association, the parent of all the state associations and provincial associations. I gave you their phone number and website. I live in Suffolk County. That's my regional association underneath that. And Westchester, which is a very prominent region just north of the city. And I gave you access to all of the regional associations as well, associated with New York State Psychological Association. So there's a lot that's there. So take a photo in case you're interested in those resources. But the point is, this is very, very, very useful information for the viewers. Puedes sacar a slide. Robin, we're reaching the end. Did you have like a final, word or two or paragraph or two before we close off today?
Only about some resources, additionally to what you've provided here. There was just a 4-part series by Chris Bragg in the Times Union in May going into June of 2020 that is informative and about what's going on here in New York State. There is the 4-part series. It's an HBO docuseries, Allen v. Farrow, about the Mia Farrow and Woody Allen case that was really told the story very powerfully. I knew people who were involved in that case, and they did a good job of reflecting what really occurred. There's a documentary, No Way Out But One, which also helps to explain some of what I've been describing, and what Roy has been talking about. And there's other research as well. I think you're going to see it all there in Roy's material. Keep in mind too, Safe Horizons is a well-known organization that does a great deal to help families when there is abuse, among others. There's a lot of others. I think it's all there in Roy's material.
Well, usually you open these things up and they give you other links, and the CDC is very, very good for providing all sorts of.
They're great. Yeah.
National Safety Council. So there's been Red Cross. There's many sources of information. Viewers also, you may be interested to know that Gabby Petito. There was a documentary based on the real events, and there was also a movie that was made based on. Obviously, movie's a movie, but there was a movie as well as a documentary. So be careful how you get your sources of information, because movies with actors, they are acting, and you don't know exactly who said what to whom. And they're actors, so you need to be careful how you get your information, your sources that you rely on. Robin, you've been a delightful guest. I'm thrilled that on such short notice I had you here. I hope that the viewers can appreciate your level of expertise and how your warmth that comes across as just a very kind person. Not only a very informed psychologist, but very kind. Thank you for being a guest. Oscar, alguna despedida? To the viewers, be careful, take care of yourselves. To the viewers, I wanted to let you know that next Thursday, the 17th, I have as a guest Dr. Raj Tola, T-O-L-A-T. He's an expert, a doctor, physician, expert in personal injury cases, and he will provide a bird's eye view as a physician specialized in that area on the types of injuries. You'd be surprised on how prevalent these injuries are: car accidents, occupational injuries, slip and falls, other kinds of accidents that take place. He is an expert in that area. He'll focus on the many kinds of injuries and what he does, and I will cover some of the psychological consequences, emotional reactions, and so forth. That's next Thursday, November 17. I will certainly promote this on social media and through other platforms. So that said, thank you, viewers, for being here. I hope that this program is, as I have intended it to be, something empowering. It's meant to be something that really is useful to you, not an indictment on anybody and saying, you did something poorly. You're not good. That's not my intention. My intention is for it to be educational and empowering, and for you to really reach out and recognize if and when you need help. Ask for it. There's many sources of help. Doesn't have to be a professional psychologist or social worker. Could be a religious, pastor. Could be a close friend that you rely on, family members. A lot of educational material on the internet. The point is, don't ignore it. Don't wait. Don't say it'll pass. It might not, and it's especially difficult now, even more trying, not only because of COVID, but as we move into Thanksgiving and the holiday season in December, a lot of people are going to be experiencing holiday stressors, the so-called proverbial holiday blues, and I will do a show on that also in December. So, buenas noches a todos. Oscar, muchas gracias. Robin, once again, it was delightful having you as a guest. And to all the viewers, good night. Be safe, like I said, in terms of the weather, the viruses, and any potential risks that you're exposed to when you go out. Be safe, all of you, and be aware, be on the lookout for your neighborhood and your community, all of you. That said, good night, everybody. Buenas noches a todos. Me despido. My good night.
Good night.